Hi, my name is Colin Cornforth, and I'm going to be presenting my research for my Master's in Education for Concordia University in Irvine. I'm going to be presenting to one of my colleagues in the Social Studies Department, Eric Pedersen. Mr. Pedersen, if you had to answer a question about one of the biggest challenges in implementing Common Core, what do you think some of the challenges that you're facing are?
I think that the writing process is a huge challenge. Kids or students forming a thesis, students using evidence, and students forming an argument are three challenges that are presented to us as teachers.
Okay, I would definitely agree with that. Molly, Reed, and I worked on this research study, and we basically thought the same thing. We looked at some of the issues that we were having, and we talked about the student shortcomings in writing, and how do we provide feedback for those students to make sure the students are getting the adequate feedback that they need to become better writers. What does that feedback look like? Where does that feedback come from? Which led us into the general purpose of the study is how do we incorporate that more targeted feedback for students? Is that feedback going to come from teachers? Is that feedback going to come from peers? Is it going to be a combination of self-feedback, peer feedback, leading us up to our two guiding questions of this research? When we're looking at these two questions, first and foremost, we're looking at teacher, peer, and self-reflective feedback. We're talking about formative feedback in the essay process. This is not feedback that's done just at the end. We're going to be analyzing that feedback based on pre- and post surveys, based on progress from one written assignment to the next written assignment. We're going to have a baseline assignment that we incorporate. And then the second question is, how effective are the different types of feedback? Because as you and I both know, teacher feedback often tends to be most widely used. Is peer feedback effective? Is self-evaluation going to be effective? So we were looking at those two questions as we went through this research. There we go. A couple of the key terms that we used, this is stuff that's coming from the paper that we wrote. The biggest one for me on here is formative feedback, since this is the focus of what we're going to be doing. We're not looking at how do students do at the end of the essay. We're looking at how do we give students feedback on things like you said, the thesis, on the evidence, on the argumentation as they're going through that writing process, rather than having them write the essay, then give them a score, give them that formative feedback as they go through it. And as we did some of our research, we found, like we thought, that formative feedback is a very effective tool, and there are different ways to approach it, which is why we adopted the question of what are the more effective ways, peer feedback, teacher feedback. We wanted to make sure that students were comfortable with the writing process so that they would be more open to revision. We found that students tended to shut down. We've seen it in our class. If they don't know what's going on, if they feel like their writing isn't good, they don't want to share with their peers, they're not open to that feedback. And students are often disappointed when they get the paper back that says, good job, 87. Nicely done, 85, with no feedback. So we want students to see that we care. The research shows that students see that you care when you give them actual feedback that can help them improve their writing in the future. When it comes to peer feedback and self-feedback, some research has shown that peer feedback is effective, but it needs to be coupled with expert feedback. You can't simply rely on peers giving feedback on every essay. Otherwise, students are not going to get the guidance that they need. But it also shows, that we need to give students adequate training. You can't simply say, look at your partner's essay, give it a score. You have to train them on what they're looking for. You have to give them examples. You have to train them. You have to calibrate them so that they are giving effective feedback. Otherwise, the quality is just not there. And I think the biggest thing, especially in talking about Common Core, when we're looking at Common Core, is the ability to assess your own writing and the writing of others. We want to develop independent learners that are critical thinkers, and not thinkers that simply rely on what experts tell them. They can look at their own writing, they can look at others' writing, and they can figure out what is wrong based on how they have been trained in previous trainings. Some of the issues, I'm sure you have dealt with some of these issues. Time, have you dealt with that issue before?
Very much so.
Very much so. Providing this constant feedback can seem like it takes a lot of time. Training the students seems like it takes a lot of time. That can be an issue. The quality, again, research has shown that the nicely done, good job, great essay, 85 out of 100, you need to give them quality feedback. Providing that quality feedback, again, takes more time. the effective filters students the affect that they have in class. If you're giving them an assignment and you're asking them to hand it to their peers, they're immediately going to be on guard. They're going to be worried that their peers are going to think that they don't know what's going on. So you have to lower those effective filters in the process. And students in general have a preference for teacher feedback. They enjoy collaboration with colleagues, but when they're getting feedback, they feel like they want feedback from the person that is the most educated in the room. So we had to kind of think about those things as we went through this process. When we're talking about the benefits of feedback, obviously formative feedback is going to be very beneficial. Students will see what they're doing wrong as they're learning rather than at the end of their learning. Norming and calibrating for students and peers also improves teacher feedback. The more teachers have to think about what they are expecting students to do when they're writing, the more they are sharing that with their students. It's building trust. If you can get students to trust their peers as they're collaborating, as they're giving each other revisions and peer feedback, you're going to build trust and collegiality. And I think one of the biggest things that Common Core is trying to produce with the 4 C's and communication and collaboration is you're going to develop those social skills that students are going to need as they move into the modern workforce. So we were really happy to see that one included in there as well. We had 2 different settings. Molly Green worked at another setting in San Diego County. You obviously know the setting of this school is affluent, successful school, high API, high achieving students. The demographics of the school, 59% white, 28% Asian, 11% Hispanic. Molly's school was a little bit different. The API, it's a new school, but the comparable schools in the area had APIs that were in the high 600s. It's predominantly Hispanic with smaller groups of whites and African Americans. The participants from my class were from an 11th grade U.S. history class. A couple of students that were recently reclassified as fluent English proficient or full English proficient. But other than that, no specific 504s or IAPs in the class. School 2 had 19 students in an 11th grade, 12th grade French class, so very different content areas, and it's not just a single class, it's the combined French 3 and AP French. So Molly had a little different experience with this process than I did. The researcher's role in this, our goal was basically to facilitate the study. We were to collect data, we were to observe student participation, interaction, engagement, writing styles, writing processes, and to provide feedback, both the formative feedback and the feedback at the end as students went through this process. We used a couple of methods to collect our data, to triangulate our data. We had pre and post surveys that students filled out about their feelings about writing before and after the writing process. We had writing journals that students completed throughout, answering questions about what they changed in their essay, what they felt like they learned as a result of the feedback that they got from their partners. We had informal observation by the researchers of the students, and then the generic end of the essay, the score. What students got at the end, and we had the baseline score, and then we had the score of the final essay at the end to see if there was any progress based on the feedback. To ensure that the study was valid, we used democratic validity, so it wasn't simply my opinion, it was the opinion of myself and the opinion of the students, and neutrality confirmability to ensure that there was no bias incorporated into this. That democratic validity ensures that there is no bias because you've got multiple perspectives engaged in this. And to make sure that all the students' information remains confidential, we handed out permission forms, and we documented all the documents would be kept in a safe place, locked in a file cabinet, and destroyed at the end of the study. Okay, so once we decided what we were going to do, we had to develop our intervention plan, and the general skeleton of the intervention plan was we were going to start with the pre-survey. We were going to see what the students knew, what they felt about writing, and then we were going to move into the entry-level assessment that would be given with little to no feedback initially. Simply, here's the paper, write it, more like a summative as opposed to a formative essay. With the second prompt, like you suggested, we would work on the thesis statement. We would work on outlining and formatting. To where do you include the argument? Where do you include the evidence? How do you incorporate that evidence and then tie it back to your thesis? And then at the end of that second prompt, there was peer, teacher, and self-feedback. Additionally, there was peer, teacher, and self-feedback throughout that process as well with the thesis statements. The third prompt, we had teacher and self-feedback. I gave the students the prompt. They outlined and wrote thesis statements. They reflected on what their thesis statement could have been. They shared thesis statements with the class or with me, and I gave immediate feedback to the class as a whole, and then they again reflected on, based on what I said about their thesis statements, what changes could they make to their thesis to improvement? What evidence could they incorporate to support their thesis statement? And then we looked at the change from essays 1 and 2 to see what the progress was as they went through that. So after we completed this study, we found that there was general improvement in the writing. There was general improvement in the thesis statements. The thesis statement improvement was a lot better because that was a targeted goal. The general writing, we didn't see as much of a broad spectrum of improvement, but we found that the thesis statements improved. Their analysis of documents, I used DBQs for the first 2 prompts. Their analysis of the documents was much better in the second prompt, with a little bit more feedback, with a little bit more guidance. There were guiding questions that came from the DBQ project that we have both used. Student support for the feedback. In general, students really appreciated the support. For the most part, they said teacher support is way better than peer editing. They had issues with the quality of the peer feedback because a lot of the peer feedback was, your handwriting is illegible. I don't understand what you're trying to say here. This is unclear. And it wasn't targeted, it wasn't guided. But I found something interesting as I was going through their responses to this, is that a lot of students put, reading somebody else's paper gave me a better understanding, it gave me context about what I was doing on my paper, about what I could change and what I could incorporate. So whereas maybe you didn't get anything from your peer, you got something from reading somebody else's to kind of put yours in context and to see what you could incorporate, which is nice for the self-feedback. I found that the evidence that students incorporated was fantastic, but taking that next step, like you said, to the analysis, to the connection to the thesis, was still a work in progress for most of the students. So, conclusions as a result of our findings, we feel like it supported most of the research that has been done on formative assessment. It is very important in spite of the fact that it maybe takes more time, it takes a little bit more effort. It is very important to student learning. Teacher feedback in general is going to be more effective, but I think that if you can train the students effectively, you can really get students to get something out of that peer feedback, and it's going to help their self-feedback when they go to reflect on what they are as a result of getting that context. And the holistic versus the components, again, the thesis statements were so much better at the end, whereas the general essay didn't show as much improvement. So maybe if we extended this study, or we extended this throughout an entire school year, you could pick different components that you wanted to focus on that might improve the whole essay by the end of the year. There we go. And then our recommendations for future research. More extended time for the study might have allowed us to get a better idea of the holistic changes as opposed to just the thesis statements. Maybe we would have seen a little bit more improvement in the analysis of student writing. Additional training for peers. I feel like there was some training for peer evaluations. There was some training for, this is what I want you to do when you write about your partners. This is how I want you to give feedback. But students weren't using that effectively, didn't give quality feedback like I expected them to, like I hoped them to, based on the training that I did give them. So we would need to incorporate more of that into the time. And then comparison of teacher and peer feedback. If you just simply did peer feedback on an essay versus teacher feedback, what would you get if you had additional training for peers? If you had given them the training, the calibration that they needed, how would their feedback compare to teachers? And if you did it anonymously, what would peer feedback say and what would teacher feedback say? If you look at those two at the end, would they be the same? Would they give the same feedback if you had additional training for the peers? Overall, I really enjoyed doing the study. I think the students enjoyed getting the extra help, appreciated the extra help, the focused attention that they got on their writing. And I think as a result of the study, they definitely see improvements in their writing and their formatting and their use of evidence. And hopefully we can see a little bit more improvement in their analysis and their overall writing as opposed to just their evidence and thesis statements. And these are the references that I used throughout the Prezi today. Thank you very much for participating, Mr. Pedersen. Do you have any questions?
I think the only thing that jumps out at me was, you know, I completely agree that teacher versus peer editing, I've seen a lot of the same issues as far as getting constructive peer feedback. Would you say there is a role for peer editing in the classroom?
I would definitely say there's a role for peer editing, especially in light of Common Core. I think the communication and I think the collaboration, even if it's not as effective in helping their writing skills, I think helping their other social skills is going to be beneficial. And I think that if you give peers the proper training, if you give them the sentence starters, if you give them the rubrics, if you give them samples, you have to do a lot of front loading with the training. But if you do that, I think that peer editing can be effective for more than just the social skill development.
Because I agree with you. I mean, I've seen a lot of what you presented as far as students necessarily getting some feedback that isn't so helpful, like this is unclear. But at the same time, like you said, the context, they've also come to me and said, I never thought about this after reading.
Gives them that different perspective.
So I've always found that helpful, but yeah, now that next step of giving them or modeling for them how to effectively peer so they can get that more positive feedback from their peers. That was the only question I had for you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for participating. I appreciate it.